Hello, everybody. Hope you had a good lunch. I am Brian Kurth. I'm the founder of Revere Skills-Based Volunteering Software based here in Denver with folks across the country, and we've got some folks across the world. And thanks so much for coming today. Thank you for joining us for DEI Meets CSR with Israel Green, founder and owner of Green Consulting Group and collaborator for Envisioning Equity, another consulting firm out of Chicago. Green Consulting Group is a consulting firm that focuses on cultural transformation through diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy and leadership development. Israel understands that we are each at different points in our journey, which is why this methodology is designed to meet you where you're at. Whether you lack the knowledge, time, skills, or vision to see what's going on with your ecosystem in your organization, this session is for you. Businesses need to play a leading role in creating a more equitable and just world, but how does your business become part of that solution? In this session, we will explore the intersection of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and corporate social responsibility. As a reminder, all workshops will be recorded, and resources mentioned will be available after the summit in the Excel events platform. We will save time at the end for the presentation for audience Q&A. For those virtual, we encourage you to send your comments and thoughts in the chat feature on the right-hand side and ask your questions in the dedicated Q&A section so we can make sure we get them answered. Please do that. We love getting the online questions. And don't forget to share what you're learning on social, hashtag #BeCivic, and share what you've learned from this session. So with that, thanks so much for being here. Take it away, Israel.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. So I get the distinct pleasure of presenting on the Hills of Life. Hopefully I can keep you entertained and energized enough so that the my name is Israel Green. I'm the founder of Consulting Group, boutique consulting firm specializing in diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. Now, I'm also a certified diversity executive, a leadership trainer and coach, and a contributing member with the Envisioning. So I'm actually here also speaking on behalf of my partner. So diversity, equity, and inclusion meets corporate social responsibility. Okay. Now this is a romantic comedy, and it tells the story of two star-crossed lovers, kind of like Harry and Sally. In all seriousness, though, I probably could have given this a better title than what you see there, but hopefully by the end of the session, the title's going to make a bit more sense. So what I'm going to be chatting about with you today, in today's session, is going to be pretty straightforward. And I want to leave room at the end of the session for a little bit of dialogue around a few questions I prepared for you. And I also want to be asking you a couple of questions for your participation throughout the presentation as well. And in a nutshell, we're going to be nice. We're going to be discussing the intersection of diversity, equity, and inclusion and CSR, and basically from conception to where it is today. Also, I'm going to challenge you with what the very notion of what CSR is and what I believe to be one or two very fundamental flaws of CSR. I'm also going to share a bit of what the demand looks like for business to play a leading role to create a more equitable role in this. And lastly, some best practices on how to move forward and be a steward of this solution and go from a state of paralysis by analysis to a state of action. So before we dive all the way in, I always like to level set and just kind of make sure we're all operating from the same playing field with the definitions. First is DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is really the presence of diversity, of differences. But as a discipline, DEI is any policy or practice that's designed to make people of various backgrounds feel welcomed and supported in a way that they can show up and perform to the fullest of their abilities. Diversifying workspace is basically one step on the journey towards a path of equity. Successful diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives are about more than just the physical aspects of diversity we think about. They're about understanding the importance of your employees, their intersecting identities, and honoring those differences, and rooting out the effects of systemic inequities that are hidden within company cultures. They foster a sense of belonging, provide outlets for your people to be able to make a difference that's basically a world is crying out for change for them to take action. So CSR, or corporate social responsibility. In a nutshell, this is a self-regulating business model. It basically helps a company be socially responsible to themselves, to the stakeholders, and to the public. Companies that practice corporate social responsibility, they commit to improving communities, and the economy, the environment, and there is no single right way to do CSR. But in today's socially conscious environment, employees and stakeholders place a premium on buying products and services from companies that prioritize CSR. And I'm going to share some stats with you later on to help support this. And then basically ESG, which stands for environmental, social, and governance. ESG is at the level that's the highest level. And if you think about it, it stands for, it basically is a level up. And basically it's about the standards, the practices that are set up. And it employs and adopts metrics and very comprehensive metrics for a company to be able to create long-term commitments to corporate social responsibility, investments, and environmental and social and governance. So this is what we're operating on today. Now, not that long ago, the business world realized the importance of diversity and inclusion and the need to be part of solving a problem that creates systemic barriers to success. So both were marginalized, and it began basically to help underrepresented groups. CSR dates back to early as the 1800s, with Andrew Carnegie challenging wealthy people to support social causes. In fact, he funded one of the first libraries for African Americans. Later in the 1800s, John D. Rockefeller followed in his steps and donated more than $500 million of his wealth, basically following in the footsteps of him. And in the 40s, it shifted from actual owners and shareholders supporting charities to actual businesses doing so. Fast forward to the 70s, and the concept of the social contract came. So that was implemented. The social contract basically was this idea that businesses function because of a consent, and as a result, those same businesses are obligated to serve the needs of society. The social contract outlined 3 key areas of responsibility. They were, number 1, jobs and economic growth for different businesses. Second was basically running the business fairly and honestly regarding the employees and the customers. And third, to become more broadly involved, to basically help the conditions of the community and the environment. So those were the 3 key areas. Now, during a very similar period of time, you had certain acts being passed associated with DEI, but it wasn't formally named diversity, equity, and inclusion yet. Early 1800s, you had the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau, which was a congressional act intended to provide freedmen and refugees, food, shelter, clothing, medical services, and newly freed African Americans homes, which then moved to the New Deal program, which ultimately provided assistance to Black Southerners to help them with food, shelter, and water. Then fast forward, you got the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, Fair Housing Act, and so on and so forth. So another intersection point is that historically, leaders and businesses, they treated this as more of a pragmatic thing as opposed to something that's embedded. So people would always think of these 2 things as a nice to have, but not necessarily the must have. And basically, for that reason, budgets are usually cut first whenever there's a competing priority. So because they couldn't measure the ROI and figure out how to focus and basically put metrics around it, all the money that goes to it is suddenly pulled. So companies struggle to build a business case when there's no budget tied to it. And this is, in fact, one of the key drivers whenever companies invite us in and they're trying to build a business case for the efforts to get some traction around either a CSR or a DEI initiative, and they have no clue how or where to begin. So because of everything that's taken place in society, the acceleration of things being shared, going viral via social media, and the lack of awareness is now a thing of the past. Brave leaders are now stepping up. They're increasingly more bold and they're more accountable for their responsibilities to basically give back to the community and make the world better. And they've got to be transparent and share progress towards those goals every year, year after year. Now, not enough companies are there yet, obviously, but the numbers are growing. The Corporate Act basically is no longer just a few idealistic CEOs. A decade ago, corporate social responsibility, actions like measuring, instituting policies to address the social woes, making sure that your company's supply chain is equitable. All of those things were considered operating above and beyond. And today, that's kind of just the baseline of where we are and what's expected for companies to be doing. That's the bare bones minimum. Social changes, advances in technology, and the ability to improve ROI have elevated issues of environmental social governance to be a requirement for investors and for employees and customers. In recent years, investors have really shown that they want to put their money where the values are. They want commitments to issues, including things like climate change, pay equity, diversity, and longstanding corporate concerns about executive compensation. And it's now being reflected in the businesses that they invest in. So basically, kind of peeling back the principles, they want to know what the ROI is. There's something that was signed by more than 1,500 investors representing 60 trillion with a T in assets and management. And this basically tells us plainly that ESG is here to stay. Now, there's something called USG, which is United Nations Sustainable Goals. And it's basically designed for sustainability. In fact, this was adopted by 190 countries in 2020. And it serves as a roadmap to basically figure out and end global poverty in that situation. Basically, leaving no one behind is the quote that was used by the secretary. And if you think about it, experiences, once you boil it all down and you pull it all out, you pull all the fluff out of it, that's what humanity is. That's what corporate social responsibility should be thriving to do, leaving no one behind. United Nations Global Compact asks companies to first do business responsibly and then solve societal challenges and business innovation and collaboration. Global challenges range from, water, environmental issues, to poverty issues and challenges, inequalities. And they're in the need of solutions from the private sector that can help deliver on. It's basically a way to transform business models and decisions with integrity. And it basically allows us to play a huge, huge role. So companies that wanted to advance the USG, just one second, let me get some water here. So incorporating the 10 principles of the compact, basically strategies and operations, and I'll share what those principles are from that contract, but it's about understanding that good practices and innovation cannot just make up for doing harm in another area. Principles such as businesses should support and protect human rights and not be complicit in the abuse of human rights. Elimination of discrimination and employment and occupation. Undertaking initiatives to build greater responsibility around the environment. Businesses should be working against corruption in all of its forms, including obstruction and bribery. So these acronyms, CSR, ESG, USG, all of these different things, what do they have to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion? Where is that crossroad? Where is that meeting, that Harry met Sally moment? And the answer is quite simple, and yet it's elegant at the same time. Corporate social responsibility, when done well, measured against rigorous industry standards, including transparency, basically is going to help you meet your goals, and using the USG as a roadmap can help you transform businesses. Solidarity against racism, against inequities, against injustices, and they are measurable acts that they can take. So taking these principles from being a response to a crisis, which is historically what DEI has really been and CSR has been, it's now going to be something that's woven into the fabric of a company. Action to improve access is important for marginalized people and communities around the world. So basically, you think about this. This is where the intersection of CSR and diversity lie. So I'm going to be sharing some additional stats with you. I know I just kind of went back, but these were just kind of a few that helped add a bit of color to help business leaders basically now understand, kind of going beyond just what the financial rewards are. But basically, after the pandemic, racial tension and social and economic crisis, they just kind of helped elevate everything. And we need this now more than ever. Basically, we need the business world to respond and to respond boldly. We need leaders that are willing to step up. Corporate social responsibility has to play a leading role in this. And DEI experts, HR experts, they have to all work together to be allies and support these actions and behaviors that tell the right story of the who and the what the corporations are to be. So systemic inequities are really glaring at this point. And no longer can we claim ignorance to these things. We know what's going on. During 2020, we all learned the answer to questions such as which workers are essential. We learned who's most likely to die during a pandemic. What communities don't have access to equality in healthcare. Which students are going to fail or fall behind due to that digital divide. And who has easy access to testing and to vaccines. And what's the impact there? This idea that business has a responsibility to the community is not new. In fact, banks, financial services, they've been required to invest in the communities that they do service in. But the idea that when diversity, equity, and inclusive behaviors are combined and support CSR, that's really where the CSR is elevated. What's important today is that the employees, the customers, the people that you're serving, they expect and want to hold businesses accountable. That's what's important here. Basically, the world is watching and taking note like they have never seen before. In August of 2019, there was a business roundtable, and there was an association whose members are, huge CEOs of Fortune 100 companies, Fortune 500. And they were really trying to understand the purpose of what corporations should be. And it was basically to build an economy that serves all Americans. And the statement was radical because prior to that, there was a doctrine, Friedman doctrine, that said businesses exist for the betterment of the shareholders. And I strongly believe that businesses are still operating with that mentality, especially when I read stats such as Shell's profits for the third quarter was, I think, $9.5 billion. Exxon reported profits, I think, of $18.7 billion in Q3. Those numbers are huge. That's just one quarter. Now, you can call me Captain Doom and Gloom, but I believe it's going to take several decades to turn this ship around. And slowly steps are being taken to move it in the right direction, obviously. But with the statement being signed by more than 180 CEOs, making a commitment, a verbal commitment to their shareholders, their employees and the suppliers and the communities that they do business in is a great start. Executive summary of the September 20 of the purpose study, it summarizes the situation that businesses are facing. And basically it says, if you knew how much our world would change in just one short year, from the global health crisis, economic freefall, social unrest of racial injustice, political divisiveness, all of these things, and a looming presidential election, certainly in the face of all these high-level risk and uncertainty, business leaders would turn and do something different and buckle down and focus on basically building their companies to help serve the communities. Now, since 2020, companies have really demanded stakeholders to do something different. Leaders bearing the highest ranks in corporate America have committed to purpose at levels that we've never seen before. It arrived at a time when executives were really kind of shirking their responsibility, but now they're stepping up and they're admitting that their businesses have been part of the problem, which is really the first step. CSR and DEI teams are collaborating with companies to act as a force for good and for change and for for the employees. So there's a lot going on here with all of this. Now, I mentioned you could call me Mr. Gloom and Doom or Captain Gloom and Doom, but I'm not the only one that thinks businesses aren't doing enough. So 52% believes businesses need to step up as it relates to climate change. 49% believe companies need to get their act together around income inequality. And it's actually 46% for workforce reskilling. Please excuse the typo there. But an interesting fact, by the year 2043, people of color will make up the majority of the US population, yet the wealth divide compared to whites will have more than doubled. And this is from the Institute of Policy Studies. So if we're doing the right things, wouldn't that wealth gap be closing as opposed to widening in that situation if we're focusing on equity and equality? So there are those business leaders that do understand going beyond the financial pieces of things. They understand the benefits of leading with purpose. And nearly all executives, 99% of them, basically see the reputational advantages of leading that way. And they noted it in their retention of employees at 95%. Consumer trust has increased as a result of that. Increased loyalty has, customer loyalty has increased. So things are happening, and leaders, CEOs, CFOs, COOs are all realizing the benefits of here. The majority of executives have acknowledged this and basically understand for employees, investors, what it means for them and truly the stakeholders and how to hold the businesses accountable. Now, 83% really do feel the urgency that companies need to make the shift, and they need to do it internally, and it starts with them, and they can be part of the solution. But work needs to be done internally. A lot more work needs to be done. And they understand, but they have to understand how to share that DI journey outside of just what they're doing. So as we look through these numbers, we've got 58% of stakeholders who will advocate for their brands based on their beliefs and values. 68% will choose a place to work based on their beliefs and values. You've got 80% that will invest based on the beliefs and values of the company. So when we start thinking about beliefs and values of an organization, all of a sudden it shifts things. So when you are not retaining talent, when you're losing and you can't recruit good employees that are different, that can bring a level of innovation because of their differences, the way that they think, the way that they present themselves is really interesting. So going back to beliefs and values, and we're going to come back to that at the end of the session, but think about these numbers just for a second. Many would argue that these actions fuel a cancel culture. And I'm curious, kind of in the room, what do you all think? Just kind of quickly opening up for a quick discussion here. Do you think stakeholders advocating for brands based on personal beliefs and values has the opportunity to fuel cancel culture? And is that a good thing? So I'm just going to kind of take a brief second here and just kind of have a little bit of dialogue around this if we can.
I think we've seen over the years that consumers dictate what businesses do in many aspects, based on the type of products that do or do not sell, right? Based on maybe locations that do or do not work. So is this that different? It's consumers stepping up and saying, hey, we're not going to work with you unless you do this. We're not going to work with you if you sell this product, do this thing. It doesn't feel new in that way. Consumers have always had that power. And I think reframing it is very helpful.
Thank you for that. So the way that it's presented for us, and kind of whenever we go to things like a good example is that's hot off the press, and it's been talked about way too much and given way too much press, in my opinion, is Kanye West with Adidas. You know, personal values of the consumers of Adidas said, hey, you all need to do something about this. If they didn't speak up, would they have done what some believe to be the right thing based on their personal beliefs and values? And people are now complaining because they're like, hey, he's been canceled out because of his personal beliefs and values. So who is to say whose beliefs and values are right and whose are wrong? And I think that for me, I do think that it does accelerate cancel culture. That's my answer. And I don't think it's a bad thing. But once again, if it doesn't align with my beliefs, would that opinion shift? I think is the big question. Any other responses to that? Got one over here.
So the word that you used, I think, is the key word, which is beliefs, which is a subjective terminology in which right or wrong is then subjective within that belief. And as we see that societies flow in their beliefs of what is right and wrong shifts and changes over time. And I think we can look at it another way in which cancel culture absolutely existed during the civil rights period, in which African Americans were essentially canceled out because of beliefs. And then that tide started to shift because the collective society said, no, our belief is that that is actually wrong. And we need to, change our frame of thinking. So it really is subjective, but it's based on a broader societal collective belief system.
Thank you. So this is, to your point over here, this is something that's been around. It's just named now. We've given it a title, which makes it seem like, okay, there's this new thing out there. But it does exist. I think that it can be a good thing. I think it can also be a bad thing, just depending on who's talking about it. Anytime we come into an organization, there's a few things that happen when we start talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. One of three things: heart rates start to accelerate. People get nervous. It's like, oh shit, he's going to be talking about, something I'm not comfortable with. The other key piece is blood pressure rises. It's like, oh my goodness, I don't know, is he going to ask me a question? And then the third piece is defenses go up. So when we come in, we try to lower those defenses. And one of the big things that I tell people is, I'm not trying to convince you that something is right or wrong. I'm not trying to convince you that, Joe over here is racist or Susie's racist by any means. What I would like to challenge you with is to ask a question is, how might my experience be different than Brian's? How might my experience be different than Susie's? And when you ask that question, you force people to answer it. Not to skirt the question by any means. They have to answer that question. How might my experience be different than yours? And when you start answering that question, you start realizing that, okay, like maybe this isn't good for everyone. Maybe there's a happy medium that we can meet somewhere in the middle. But that's the question we should be asking is, how might my experience be different than someone else's? Is there anyone else that wanted to give any input on that piece? Yes, ma'am. Give her mine. Yeah.
Something I just like to talk about also involving cancel culture in general is that it's hard to differentiate because I think when you just cancel people, you don't invite them to learn. And so then it's finding the balance of, for example, with Kanye, it's hard to invite someone like that into a learning space, so then it's finding other people and figuring out, okay, is this a time when we should cancel them, or is this a time where we should invite them in to learn something new? So it's just when you were talking about cancel culture, it just got me thinking of like, okay, or should we be implementing that in business spaces, or should we be implementing spaces to learn about something like this incident?
So Naomi, thank you. It is Naomi, right? Okay, thank you for that. There's something that we teach on, and it's conversation stems, and it talks about the cycle that we might find ourselves whenever we've been the person that's offended, the person that was the offender, or a combination thereof. So you can either attack, avoid, or engage. That's the crossroads that you're going to find yourself in. And with each one of these, it leads us to a different cycle and ultimately a different outcome. So when we attack, we basically, I've got you coming at me, I'm going to come right back at you and try to kind of one up you. And that basically creates this adversarial cycle. And at the end of it, that outcome is basically enemies. You've got the avoid stage, which basically, you know what? They're not really talking about me. They're talking about Susie. My dog's not in that fight. I'm just going to kind of sit over here and just be quiet. Or if they are talking about you, it's like you don't want to cause any sort of confrontation. So you avoid it. And that leads to this cycle of basically strangers at the end of it, and you never end up getting to know anyone. And the place that we want to find ourselves is that engagement space where we engage, and that creates a collaboration. And at the end, that creates allies and advocates at the end of this. So as you go through this, thinking about the attack, the avoid, engage, all of you all are in here for a specific reason. And I always say, people are like, well, do you enjoy what you do? And I'm like, you know what? I don't think you really get into this work if you don't enjoy it in some capacity. Is it tiring and taxing? Absolutely. But the key piece that I have to remind myself is that each of us has a responsibility to go further than the other person that has absolutely no knowledge in this area whatsoever. And that's really where we should be inviting those individuals, and still protecting your mental health and wellness at the same time. But we should take that step to at least invite someone and engage with them. And like, you know what? Hey, I noticed that you mentioned this. That kind of didn't sit well with me. Do you mind if we discuss it? Do you mind if we have a conversation around it? And I think people will respect you for doing that if they have any level of dignity within themselves and humanity within themselves. But just kind of keep that conversation stem cycle in your mind. Anything else on that? All right. So the cause for change is growing louder. A few years after the murder of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, it has sparked nationwide change. This movement continues to evolve. Americans are making their expectations clear on what they need and want. And they still see racism within the workplace, and they fear it in their communities as well. For business, it's a call to lead and really kind of corral systemic change and make an impact in this world, in our workplace, in the communities, and beyond. So statistics address this point. Whenever we're covering what we're covering today, I'm going to be covering some more stats, but the demand is there for companies to play a leading role where we are. So how do we move this forward and become part of the solution? How do we become part of that solution and that is sustainable? Some of the strategies to drive change is going to require collaboration between DEI teams, employee resource groups, human resource groups. You've heard people mention ERGs all day today, business resource groups, whatever you want to call them. The organization is explicit in living its DEI values and actively supports, invests in, and advocates for DEI-related initiatives in the community. The organization has to take bold stands on issues that they typically would not do. They have to take a bold stand, whether it's Black Lives Matter, Me Too, gender-based violence, United Against Racism, Stand Up for Human Rights, Stop Hate Against Asians, whatever it is. They have to make a statement, not just internally, but externally to the world, so that people that are working there, you have a right for whatever company you're working with to know who you're working for. What are their values? What are their principles? Because if your goals doesn't align, why should you be spending 40, 50, 60 hours a week? That's a long time there. Organizations have to address and atone for any past behaviors and policies. This is a tough one. Who's going to say, you know what, yeah, we made a mistake. I'm sorry, and make atonement for it. But that has to be there, because if you don't make atonement for what you've done, there's an issue there. You have to get past that piece. So all of these three things is just a few easy ways of putting this into practice. A big thing, when I think of atonement, I think of the Dakota Pipeline. And I think it started being built in like 2014, went up through 2017. By mid-2017, the Dakota Pipeline was being built. You had the Sioux Nation that was out there. They were protesting peacefully. These peaceful protests, which we have a right to do, were met with mace, met with water cannons, met with dogs. And I thought about playing the video for you all. But watching this unfold and having the government say, hey, you know what? Let's just kind of see how this plays out. So initially, the Dakota Pipeline was supposed to run, I think, through Missouri, if I'm not mistaken. And basically, they said, hey, you know what? We can't put this pipeline here because if there's a spill, then basically what's going to end up happening is it could contaminate the water for the capital. So we got to move this pipeline. Where are we going to move it to? Well, we can move it over to these other lands. Someone says, hey, the other lands, there's a treaty over there that we can't disturb this land. This treaty goes back to the beginning of time, and we can't overturn this treaty. So they ended up putting the pipeline there. Now, the pipeline, I think it created something like 42 million jobs or something crazy like that. However, they weren't worried about the indigenous nation that was on the land. They weren't worried about the oil spilling and impacting that community, but they were worried about it impacting the other community. So the question becomes, the benefit of it creating 42 million jobs or whatever it is that greater than the impact to this nation? So they built it at first, initially, they said, okay, hey, you know what? We're not going to build it there. It then went back and the Trump administration overturned it and they ended up building it. At this point, I believe there has been, and it's shut down now if I'm not mistaken, but I believe there has been roughly something like equivalent of 383,000 gallons of oil that has been spilled. 383,000 gallons of oil has been spilled on this reservation. So my question that I'm posing to you is, the benefit and the financial gain for the community greater than the impact? And so the government backed this, the Army Corps of Engineers backed it. You had investors coming from Florida, coming from Texas, they backed it. And then you had the administration for the United States of America backing it because of the almighty dollar. So when you think about that and corporate social responsibility, going back to that environmental impact and how it should be helping sustain that, do you all think it was the right thing to do to move forward with the pipeline? Anyone, and there is no right or wrong answer. It's, beliefs and values. Would anyone make the decision to move forward with it? Would you make the decision if it was to go in place in Missouri where it was originally intended to be? Still no? It's a lot of money, a lot of jobs, communities hurting. There's a moral dilemma there. So how do we balance what that dilemma is? Does the good over here outweigh the bad over here? That's a challenge with corporate social responsibility that executives have to make whenever they're making a decision. Was anyone aware of the Dakota pipeline and how much oil has been spilled up to this point? A little bit. Was anyone aware of the financial impact from a positive perspective? What do you all think would be the answer in that situation? Because the reality is, as you move up in organizations and as you support this, you're going to have to come up with answers for things like this. And you're going to be at some point, and it may not be as great as the Dakota pipeline, but it's going to be a challenge where your personal beliefs are going to be challenged, but there's profit to be made. There's people that are going to be impacted in a negative and a positive way. So how do you balance that? Any ideas around that?
Go beyond just the financial benefit, jobs to the financial, benefit. I think when you're making decisions at the executive level, you have to look at it and just say, what's beyond the numbers? What is the community impact? Stakeholding used to be a real thing, and I feel like that's kind of gone by the wayside, but how are the communities impacted? What's the contract to the communities that will be doing this to? And there was just a ton of mishandling in this thing because they were talking about how we need energy for the United States when it was taking, oil from Canada down to the Gulf to be transported. It wasn't for the United States. It created significant mistrust without buying in initially to get the communities to buy into and want the jobs, right? So there was just you've got to get the not factoring in people, communities, and the impact you have. It's a lose-lose situation. No matter how much money you think you're going to gain, without that buy-in in those contracts with communities, you're going to fail.
And this particular situation failed on so many fronts. From the treaty that's been there since the beginning of time that says, hey, you can't come on this land. You know, this is protected land. And this treaty can never be undone. It's failed there. It's failed from a perspective of placing the value of an indigenous life versus the value of someone else in this other community that's not. I mean, that is a telltale sign that says, hey, you know what? Sorry, but your life is worth less, so we're willing to move this. And I guarantee that if you lined up the two groups, you would definitely see the disparity between those two groups. But to your point, I don't think there is no easy answer to this. That's the difficult part about corporate social responsibility, because yes, you do have a responsibility to the stakeholders. They're in it to make money. You have a responsibility that's even greater to the community, to the environment, to the people, to humanity as a whole. A few other things to put it into practice. Organizations help its community by promoting economic growth, addressing income inequality, and groups that have been historically disadvantaged. The organization encourages employee volunteers in community projects by providing time off and/or compensation and rewards where appropriate. A few other things: the organization philanthropy and social responsibility strategies promote DEI. The organization's community investment supports those most in need. The beautiful thing about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the big takeaway that I want you all to take away from this is, for this to work, diversity, equity, and inclusion has to be foundational, because that's really where the education is going to come from to figure out who in the community is being impacted. Where are those inequities? You know, what does this look like for the collective as a whole? Historically, what's happened? What are those barriers? And without that education, and when we are viewing things from this lens of this ethnocentric state, and we haven't moved over to the ethno-relative state, we can't see it because we're viewing everything through our own lens. And it's so difficult to better understand what your situation might be if I'm only viewing things through this lens. So I hear people all the time say, well, you know what? Racism doesn't exist. I'm like, oh, tell me more. And they're saying that, and I have to realize, okay, where are they on the spectrum of this model of intercultural sensitivity that's out there? And when I realize it, and I take a moment and pause, and I pull the anger back, and because the first thing in me, I want to lash out, and it's like attack. It's like, okay, you know what? Don't attack. Think about it. Engage. Why? Tell me more. Why do you think that? Well, I've never experienced anything like that. I get it. Okay. That helps me understand it. So in other words, for you, it doesn't exist. Would you mind if I share a story with you? And then at that point, you put the human element back in the room. So whenever we're able to kind of add that piece in there, that's what's important and what is able to move this thing as a foundational. So built on DEI as a foundation in education, CSR, the pillars of it, and then the ESG at the top of it, which is really about that strict governance, that strict measurement, and how to take it from being a check the box, a flavor of the month, to a sustainable and something that's really embedded in the fabric of the organization. So I want to open it up to a couple of discussion questions. How much time do we have? Okay, great. So what is the flaw of corporate social responsibility as a standalone without the support of DEI and ESG?
It's performative. It lacks a genuine starting place, saying ignore what we've done, take the gift. I think sadly, corporate giving is really littered with a lot of performative actors or institutions that are trying to right a wrong. And instead of atoning, they're just throwing money at what they've caused.
Thank you for that. So it's performative, one of the flaws. I was expecting everyone to be quiet on this one. So I'm glad. I think we got
Just to add to that, I think with ESG at the top and thinking about DEI as the foundation, it's an accountability structure, but it's also not accountability in terms of compliance, but accountability in terms of like this reciprocity in how the work gets done in a very authentic and impactful way.
So accountability, thank you. Other flaws of CSR. So going back to the definition of CSR that we started out with, and it is really that self-regulating business model that helps a company be socially accountable to itself, its stakeholders, and the public. And I don't want to give you what I think my answers are. I would love to hear a couple of more. If you all think that there are flaws, or if CSR as it stands is flawless and it works. Anyone else?
CSR is complete without the inclusion of DEI.
So CSR is not complete without the inclusion of DEI. Tell me more.
It's just taking a narrow look at what you think your corporate citizenry is without thinking inclusively and holistically about how you as an organization are a citizen of the communities you serve.
Did you all get that? What's your name? Beverly, thank you. So for me, there are three flaws that come to mind. The fact that it's self-regulating. Anyone can say, yep, we're doing a great job. And without the metrics, without the guidance to figure out and say, hey, what does a great job look like? And a great job for who? A great job for someone that resembles you? A great job for the government? So that's the first flaw for me that jumps out, is it's self-regulating. It's, you're holding yourself accountable. And when you've got companies that are doing things like, hey, we're gonna put this pipeline in here, we don't care about this other group, that's an issue. So for me, there should be, or there needs to be, some sort of governing entity that, and I don't know who it is or what it is. I don't think it can be the government. It definitely cannot be the government. But there needs to be some sort of guiding principle. And that's what ESG does. And that's why I kind of like ESG as kind of like the umbrella of this, because they're more strict in their regulations and their benchmarks. I think they have close to 200 different benchmarks that they go through. And even for like the DEI work that we do, we measure 4 different groups, 15 different categories under those groups, ranging from internal, which is really about the leadership, the mission, the vision, through internal, which is about how do you attract, retain, and grow diverse talent? What does that look like? How do you promote them? The accessibility piece, that bridging strategy, the communication, the education around it, and then the external, the CSR, the community. What does that look like? Your stakeholders, your shareholders, all of that stuff. And then we ended up bumping it up against 276 different benchmarks. So we try to be as rigorous as possible, and we come into organizations and we say, okay, hey, we're going to do this assessment company-wide on every piece of your business to see where it's not embedded. That same thing needs to be happening for CSR at that same level. And we benchmark them from everything on a 5 level, everything from inactive to reactive. So something happens in the community, oh, let's respond to it. To, okay, we're being proactive. We're now going to progressive, and now we're at best practice, global best practice. And it's not based off of what we think is global best practice. It's based off of ISO standards, the International Standard of Operations for DEI. It's based off of the Center for Global Inclusion. That's had tons of organizations contribute to this model. So that's what I think, for me, CSR is really lacking, and the flaw that's there. What obstacles would you say present themselves for these two, DEI and CSR, areas banned as a standardized practice to work collectively? What obstacles present themselves for CSR and DEI to work collectively together?
I think executive buy-in, or just looking at it as one thing. As in, there's like some organizations don't differentiate between the two, which is dangerous because then it's all like, oh, that's just DEI and CSR, that's one thing, and they've emphasized one aspect of it more than the other.
So executive buy-in and looking at it as just one whole complete thing when it is in fact two separate entities. Another piece can be the fact that this is solely put into the realm of human resources. And that is a mistake. That is a grave mistake. So human resources is dealing with so many other things, and you put this on their lap. And it's like, okay, wait, what do I do with this? And it falls by the wayside. Competing priorities, that's a huge obstacle as well. Any other obstacles you can think of?
Political temperament?
Yes, absolutely. And we saw that with the last administration. They were trying to wipe DEI education out of certain different areas. Also, understanding what these things are. I was just having a conversation earlier where I think, and you can add to this. Justice Clarence Thomas said that he didn't know what diversity meant. So
Did you all hear that on Monday? When I think it was Monday? Was I the only person that heard that in the news? Okay, all right.
You said what happened? Oh, okay.
So affirmative action is up in front of the Supreme Court, and there were hearings, discussions on Monday, I think. And at the end of the day, it was 5 hours of discussions. And at the end of the day, I was sharing with Israel. I'm like, I couldn't believe this, that, Clarence Thomas, at the end of the day, Clarence Thomas, for those of you who may not be following Supreme Court, he's the one African-American male on the Supreme Court, said, I've been hearing a lot about diversity, but I don't have a clue as to what that means, to quote. So anyway.
Yes.
Can you repeat that?
Judge Clarence Thomas is a beneficiary of affirmative action and diversity programs. He's where he is because of those initiatives. So he knows what diversity is.
And that was my thought, that he was trying to poke the bear and get someone to say something so that he can possibly come at it a different angle that would benefit him. So education around what this stuff actually is, critical race theory. People are so confused on what critical race theory is. They think it's been taught to kindergartners. And it's like, come on, understanding what it is around it. That's a big obstacle. The other two questions, I'm just going to give you these to think about as you leave here. It's, what is it that you need to specifically think about in your role based on this discussion? And how does your company define and measure value? And I ask these 4 questions because I want you to be equipped to be thinking about what objectives you might have coming at you as you try to go back into your offices and do this work at a larger scale. So with that, I will.
We still have 5 minutes, so
Okay.
we can
And then
address
if we
those.
want to open up questions, or
Folks want to comment on those 2 last questions.
So I'd actually like to just get a little clarity on some of the concepts here. What you're talking about, or at least how I'm digesting it, is that the DEI being the foundation is the why we are doing what we're doing. The CSR is the what. This is how, or this is what we're going to do, and then the ESG is the how, the measurement. Am I understanding that?
So, and keep in mind that CSR is not the only method of this. It's the only piece that we're talking about today because it's where CSR meets DEI. But you're absolutely correct. It is the why, the what, and the how to measure it. That's a great way to frame it. Thank you. Other thoughts?
Ramona Houston, social impact strategist out of Atlanta, Georgia. I have a question for you on the last question. In terms of measuring value, beyond just the percentages on diversity, equity, and inclusion? How do you measure your success in DEI and A?
Great question. So I mentioned those 276 benchmarks. We come in and we basically assess where an organization is, going beyond just that initial piece of, whenever we talk about DEI, let's be real here. We're talking about two things. This is what it always boils down to. Let's hire more women and hire more Black people. If we do that, we're diverse. And we measure it not by that, but we measure it by the inclusion piece of it. At the end of the day, if we were to survey people, and every day it changes, so we really coach and train leaders to be asking the question every single day, is my team going home and telling someone about their experience with me and with this company? So we measure the inclusion by, is someone going out through surveys, assessments? That's one way. We also do it via numbers to make sure that, hey, if you've got a rate of hire for diverse talent at 60%, and yet you've got less than 5% at the top, that's an issue. So how do those start to marry and start to measure up? So we look at, across all these different areas, everything from that internal piece that I mentioned, vision, mission, leadership, to promotional, to your content, your policies, your procedures. How many have we looked at that have been rewritten? Or are we getting additional talent in? What does that look like whenever we're interviewing? Are those interviewees seeing people like them on that interview board? Because if you don't, you think, okay, well, do I really have a place here? And you're doing yourself a disservice. So it's stuff like that that we're looking at, but it goes beyond just and it's such a nebulous thing. It really is, especially when you start talking about inclusion and belonging. And it can shift day to day. If you've got a crappy day at work, you feel like, you know what, I don't belong here. But hopefully your leader is engaging enough to overcome that one incident and that one, feeling that's immediate to say, I still do belong here. It's just a bad day. Does that answer the question a bit? Other questions?
Anyone else?
I just have a question kind of around benchmarking and the metrics and kind of how to really get that data and what do you compare it to? Having these DEI programs and, outside of kind of surveying people, which is kind of where we've landed, what are the good metrics to see that DEI is actually affecting the people in your community or in your company, other than some obvious numbers?
Great question again, thank you. So one way is making sure that you are doing the assessments. You have to understand where you are today. Usually what's happening is CEOs, executives are guessing where the problem is, and they're not really asking the people that are doing the work. If you want to know how a company is doing, ask the people that are doing the job. They're going to be able to tell you directly. So when we come in, we do assessments, we do surveys, we do one-on-one interviews, we do focus groups, and we do it in a space that removes the C-level so that people can really have a candid conversation. We understand when to lean in and what that looks like. We compile that data, compare it to industry benchmarks as well, and then we start putting together programming and strategies for that. But it does require listening to and hearing what your employees are saying and those that are around you. And the numbers, the numbers, even from a visual perspective, they tell a story as well. So you really have to see that as well. I think someone else had a question over here. Okay.
Well, that is, one quick, okay.
It's not a question, but I would say we've created internal metrics to look at what are we currently doing? How much participation in our DEI programs have we seen? Is it increasing? Is it decreasing over time? We have managerial accountability metrics, and we've actually put our norms as part of our performance reviews so that we can measure, performance of employees based on whether or not they're, doing and engaging in the activities that we've educated on.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming today. And thank you, Israel Green of Green Consulting and Envisioning Equity out of Chicago. And there we go. In terms of contact, please feel free to reach out directly to Israel. And just coming up next year, our fourth workshop, CSR in Leadership in the Ballroom. Disaster response in Cripple Creek 1, next door, and pledges to outcomes in the Cripple Creek 2, right here. So thank you, everybody. And
for anyone that wants some additional resources, we've got some links that we've kind of compiled some data from. So feel free to reach out via Envisioning Equity, and we can send you those links directly if that's helpful, or through you.
yeah, for sure. Did everyone hear that? He didn't have his mic up to his. But yes, can get that too. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.